You're listening to Econ to ICOM, thoughtful conversations with influential figures from economics and public life, exploring the economic issues they've shaped and the careers they've made. Here are your hosts, Paul Johnson and Michael Kell.
Welcome to Econ to ICON. In this episode, we talked to Tim Harford, one of the UK's best-known interpreters of economics and statistics. He's a long-standing economist at the Financial Times, the author of multiple best-selling books, including The Undercover Economist, and presenter of BBC's More or Less.
What's striking about Tim's career is how unplanned it was. He started out in more conventional roles, in consulting, working for Shell, working for the World Bank, but gradually moved into writing and broadcasting, more driven by curiosity and accident than by design. We talked to him about those shifts and what it takes to step away from a traditional career path and build something much more independent.
We also explore the craft of explaining economics and communicating it. Tim reflects on how you can take quite technical ideas and make them accessible without losing the substance, or why that really matters in a world full of data, claims and counterclaims.
And there's a broader thread running through the conversation, which is about curiosity, about following ideas, connecting different fields, and not being confined too tightly by any single way of looking at the world.
This is a conversation about economics,
But also about how you make sense of the world more generally.
Tim Harford, welcome to Econ to Icon. How are you?
I'm very well.
Tim, you were born, I think, in 1973 in Kent. And my understanding is you moved around a bit as a family before you ended up in Aylesbury, I think, which is where you went to school. So maybe tell us a bit more about your family background and maybe a bit about what you were like as a kid.
Yeah, my wife, who's from Lancashire, insists that I am definitely Southern. I protest that until I was 12, I'd spent all the years I can remember in either near Manchester or near Sheffield, which I regard as northern, but she insists that Sheffield is not really northern, and in any case, I'm a southerner. So listeners can write in with their opinions on that. So what was I like as a child? I was a bit of a nerd. I'm still a bit of a nerd. I was interested in all kinds of academic subjects. So I was interested in English. I was interested in maths, interested in the whole business, and also interested in games. So if you want to really burnish my nerd credentials, I was one of those people playing role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons back in the 1980s when the Satanic Panic was at its height. So you can see a few threads there, I guess. I mean, the interest in numbers, the interest in creativity, the interest in writing. So my father has a doctorate in physics from Oxford University and worked all his life in computing. He would install these great big mainframe computers in big banks, that kind of thing. My mother was a adult literacy and numeracy teacher part-time and also a hacker. So she used to strip the copy protection off computer games and so I could play free computer games. And her argument was that this was completely legitimate since there was no way that she was going to buy me the computer games and therefore there was no loss of revenue to the computer games companies. So yeah, I think that's my teenage years. A lot of access to computers, a lot of games, a lot of nerds.
So you were happy being a nerd?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was all fascinating to me. I think being interested in ideas, being interested in what you're learning at school, it's not a bad way to go through school. I think if you're sitting there in class and you don't see the point of any of it and it all seems terribly tedious, I mean, that just must be miserable. But I was lucky enough not to be in that position.
I was thinking more about the kind of social implications of being a nerd.
Oh, well, you just need to find your fellow nerds. So I had plenty of friends who were also nerds. You know, we'd play Dungeons and Dragons together, or strictly speaking, not Dungeons and Dragons, but whatever. And indeed, I'm still in touch with some of them. We're still playing games together in our early 50s. So yeah, it wasn't a lonely existence at all.
And do you remember what you wanted to be? What the first thing that you wanted to be? Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, I wanted to write. I wanted to write fantasy novels. So your top quality blockbuster, massive fantasy series. So I used to, obviously Tolkien, I used to read Tolkien, but also Frank Herbert and Dune, Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders novels, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea. But yeah, I wanted to write that kind of thing.
So
Wow.
already quite a lot of continuity with where you are now.
Well, in hindsight, I think you can connect the dots. The other thing I used to do as a 12, 13-year-old is wrote and designed and published a role-playing magazine, just a fanzine. So me and a couple of friends would write the articles, and some other friends would draw the pictures. So there was an interest there in journalism and in writing and in editing and in all of that, which, I mean, funnily enough, as a student in my 20s, I didn't really do much of that. But given where I am now, you look back and go, well, I guess I've been interested in this for a very long time.
So what was it then drew you to, as with many of us and many in government and journalism, you went to Oxford to read PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. You didn't go to read English or any of the other things I guess you could have done, given that wide range of interests.
Yeah, I had no idea if they would have let me in to read English or physics or maths, which were my main A-level subjects. I mean, so doing English and physics and maths shows somebody who's not really willing to stop hedging his bets. And so when I was looking at university courses, again, I was looking at courses that would let me study several things, wouldn't just kind of put me down on one side of this, I think, slightly artificial fence between the arts and the sciences. So I was looking for something that would allow me to keep those options open. But then I had some lucky accidents. So I went to an open day at Brasenose College. My father had gone to Brasenose. So I thought, well, my dad went to Brasenose. Seems fine. I thought, oh, maybe law or maybe PPE. So I went to the PPE talk, and they seemed very nice. And they said that Brasenose had a good tradition of PPE, which is true. So I thought, okay, PPE. You can see I've really given this a lot of thought. So PPE it was. And then another accident was, I never thought, I didn't really know anything about economics. I hadn't studied economics. I had no reason to believe it would be interesting. Philosophy and politics, particularly political philosophy, that sounded interesting. So I was going to study all of these subjects for a year, and then at the end of the first year, I'd drop economics. It's quite common for people to drop one of the subjects. And I think I didn't really notice that actually I was enjoying economics. I was doing pretty well at it. And at the end of the first year exams, I got good grades. But because we tend to set ourselves on these particular courses, I still had the same plan. I was going to drop economics. I knew who my tutors were going to be. I knew what I was going to study, the different sort of different courses I was going to specialize in. And then my tutor, lovely man called Peter Sinclair, brilliant economist, wonderful human being, wrote in the summer, the end of the first year, to me, nice handwritten note, old school, and said, you did very well in your exams, and maybe you should consider not dropping economics. Which is a really very straightforward observation to make. But since he'd taken the trouble to write a letter encouraging me to think about my choice, I thought about it, actually I do rather like economics. So I stuck with economics. And if Peter had not bothered to write that letter, we certainly wouldn't be having this conversation. I'd be doing something else. I mean, who knows? Might have worked out just fine that way as well. But I'm really struck by quite how clueless I was at the time.
So in many ways, that's wonderful to hear. And there's lots of parallels there with my route through as well.
Yeah. Well, we ended up in the same place for not unrelated reasons. Yeah.
Tim, after your PPE degree, I think you maybe flirted with the idea of academia. Is that right?
Yeah, I didn't know what I wanted to do. This is a theme, right? And I bumped into Peter Sinclair at a bus stop in central Oxford. And Peter by then this is the man who wrote the letter to me to persuade me not to quit economics. At the time he wrote that letter, he was already on his way out. He was moving to teach at Birmingham for various reasons. I think more personal than academic reasons. But he said, would you like to go to Ireland for a year and teach economics at University College Cork? I thought to myself, sure, why not? With the usual deep reflection. Peter had a relationship with UCC. He was an external examiner, and they had quite a young department, didn't have many well-qualified people. And so for a few years, Peter had basically been sending over one of his students after their Oxford degree to basically regurgitate whatever it is they'd been taught for the last 3 years, regurgitate that to the students at Cork. And UCC seemed to think this is a perfectly reasonable way to get a few lecture courses delivered. And so I said, yeah, sure, let's do that. So Peter wrote recommending that they take me, and they did. And so off I went for a year in Cork, at which point I'm about the same age as many of the students that I'm teaching, but my colleagues are older than me, more experienced than me. And so suddenly I have these professional role models around me, lovely people. And, I can see what they do and how they think and have conversations with them and think to myself, well, maybe this is something for me. And then at the end of that year, during that year, I applied to go back to Oxford to do the master's degree at Oxford, which is a 2-year degree called an MPhil, specialising in economics. And that's really a serious academic qualification. It's you're halfway to your PhD if that's what you want to do, or you've acquired, if you do that, you've acquired a lot of the technical skills to call yourself an economist. And yes, I remember trying to waiting for the news as to whether I got a place. Well, I got a place, but again, because I was an idiot, I didn't want to take the place up unless I got some funding. There was funding from the Economic and Social Research Council. There wasn't a lot of money. I think it was about £4,000 a year. Call it £8,000 a year today. I'm not exactly sure. And really, given that I could easily have just gone off and been a management consultant or work for an oil company or work for a bank, or the opportunity cost, to give us an example from economics, I give a phrase from economics, the opportunity cost of going to spend 2 years doing a master's degree was much higher than a few grand of funding here or there. But in my head, I was going to do this if I got the funding, and I was not going to do it if I didn't get the funding. And they said, well, you've got the funding. And so at that point, I knew I was going to go back to Oxford. Again, for the most silly and arbitrary of reasons. But yeah, that was my next 2 years planned out.
So you did your master's, and at the end of that, you, I guess, had decided against an academic career because you went into a more kind of corporate direction, seems to me, from what I understand.
Yeah, so I was wondering whether to do a PhD, and I spoke to my thesis supervisor, Paul Klemperer, who was an auction specialist and game theorist, and a lovely man, also formidably clever, just a brilliant economist, but also very direct. And I did go off to the corporate world. We could discuss that in a moment, but I wasn't very happy, and I thought maybe I should go back and do a PhD. And so I called him. I don't know, I'd been away for 6 months or something. I called him and said, what do you think? And he basically said, well, I think you basically, you're not good enough. Like, you should do something else. Very, very good piece of advice.
But do you remember at the time how you felt about that? I mean, it must have been quite wounding, right? There's a guy that you really respect.
I don't remember being wounded by it. I mean, it felt very on brand for Paul. I mean, Paul and I, we still regularly see each other. We go for long walks, talk. I have a tremendous amount of affection for him as well as respect for him. But no, I just thought it was good advice. He wasn't saying that I was incompetent or that I was, incapable in some way. He was saying that this was not where my comparative advantage lay. And he was completely right. So it's a valuable thing to be able to look a friend in the eye and to be able to tell them the truth.
Is there more you want to say, Tim, about your experience of various corporate type jobs where I think you worked as an economist and maybe not only as an economist?
Yeah, so I did a few things. So after my master's degree, I signed up to be a management consultant with the usual wisdom and deep reflection. I'd gone to various management consultancy presentations, and I went to a lot of interviews with management consultants. So PricewaterhouseCoopers or McKinsey, various boutiques that people had never heard of, or they've all merged and gone away and turned into each other. But anyway, the fact that it took me 10 different applications and, 20 interviews probably should have told me that, in fact, I do not want to be a management consultant. So I joined this consulting firm, and you know what? It turns out I didn't want to be a management consultant. Didn't enjoy the work. I didn't respect most of my colleagues. I mean, they were smart, but I didn't respect what they were doing. And it was also very much not my kind of thing. And so that was one job. And another job that I did for a while was to work for the scenarios team at Shell, which we could talk about at some length if you like. I think scenarios are a fascinating way of thinking about the future. And I think economists need better ways to think about the future. But if you're wondering how it is that I ended up working for Shell, exactly the same as all the other stuff. They had some internship that I'd applied for actually way back as an undergraduate, where you get 250 quid to basically go on some interesting holiday, doing something worthy. Anyway, so I had this early connection with them. They sent me this 250 quid subsidy towards my holiday. I kept in touch. And in the end, some years down the track, that turned into working for the scenarios team. But
yeah, I mean, perhaps we should get on to the reason, I guess, we're speaking to you. We're not actually speaking to you because you were a rubbish management consultant or you worked in the Shell Scenarios team.
That is one of the reasons you're speaking to me. Otherwise, I'd still be a management consultant. But yes, onward.
Well, I suppose that's but because you have made your mark as an extraordinary communicator of economics. And I guess, as you say, you had a wonderful apprenticeship working with John Kay, and you probably learned some things in the Shell Scenarios team. But can you just tell us how you, in this unplotted path of yours, you fell into this world of writing books and being a journalist?
Sure. So would it surprise you to hear that it was a complete accident and not very well thought through?
No, not a lot at this point.
By now, probably not. So a few things. One was while working at Shell, I met David Bodanis, who was a brilliant science writer, historian, just a great writer, really, really interesting books. And he was doing some work with Shell about technology, the history and the future of technology. And he and I became friends, and we used to go off for coffee and talk big ideas about all kinds of stuff. But he had published this wonderfully successful book called E = MC², which was a book about the history of that equation, all the different elements of that equation. Where did E come from? Where did M come from? And then Einstein, and then eventually the bomb. And I loved the book. And I remember sitting having coffee and saying, I'd like to write a book like E = MC², only for economics. At which point he said, well, are you waiting for permission? Who's stopping you? No one can stop you writing the book. And that was the moment, really, when I began working on The Undercover Economist. I think with really no idea about what I was doing or what I didn't know about that project. So that was part of it. Then while working at Shell, this is 2001, 2002, I was working on The Undercover Economist part-time. And by the end of 2002, I'd basically had a draft. I remember saying to my partner, well, I finished the first draft and I didn't have an agent, I didn't have a publisher, I didn't have anything. I just had 80,000 words of economics. So I said, I don't know if anybody will ever read this book, but I'm glad I wrote it. I'd really enjoyed that process of trying to create this thing. I did, of course, eventually get an agent and eventually get a publisher, but it took a while. And I imagined that the process of getting an agent or a publisher was basically you send off your manuscript or your pitch and they write back and they say no. And then you try again for somebody else and they write back and they say no. And you keep doing it and eventually somebody says yes, or maybe nobody ever says yes. I thought that's the process. Actually, the process is you send it off and the first person I sent it to said, maybe, send me some more, tell me some more. And so you've got a lot of maybes because there's really, people just want to see, unless it's a total disaster. And it wasn't a total disaster. People were sort of curious and they wanted to see more. They wanted to see, could I actually finish it? And once I'd finished it, could I actually kind of fix it? Because it read a little bit like a book by somebody who's never written a book before, which it was. So the whole process took a very long time. And during this process, what people would say is, well, why should anybody buy a book about economics from you? You've got a master's degree in economics and you've done a bit of work for an oil company. Who are you? Who cares? And so I thought, well, maybe if I was a journalist, people would buy my book. So I applied for an internship at the Financial Times. And thanks to a number of other pieces of good luck, I was offered this internship. It was the Peter Martin Fellowship in memory of Peter Martin, who was a great business commentator who had died quite young and was much loved and much missed by readers and by his colleagues. And so in his memory, they decided, okay, we're going to offer this internship. And I was the first one. And I had sort of assumed I would kind of hang around the FT and do the photocopying. But actually, what they wanted me to do was write the editorials, which feels like a pretty grown-up job to give to a 29-year-old with no writing experience. But actually, it does make sense. So the editorials are, for those who don't know newspapers that well, they're the bits that sort of represent, this is the opinion of the newspaper. And actually, that's a perfectly sensible thing to give to a 29-year-old with no experience, because if what they write is nonsense, you just go, all right, that's nonsense, and you rewrite it. It's actually very easy to supervise. So I spent 3 months doing that. And at the end of the 3 months, I said, I'd love a job working here. And they said, that's great. Yeah, we'd like to give you a job. Sadly, there's a hiring freeze, but keep in touch. And that was the beginning of my relationship with the FT. And by the time that I finally had a publisher and an agent for the Undercover Economist, I was living in America. I was working for the World Bank with this kind of strange relationship with the FT, where I was occasionally contributing pieces. I did an interview with Steve Levitt, the author of For Economics, and sent that interview in while actually working in America for the World Bank. Just like probably wasn't actually allowed to do that. I had this book that was coming out, and then finally in 2006, it kind of all happened. The book had come out in America, the book came out in the UK. The FT phoned up and said, we've got a job, come and write our economics leaders. So I left the World Bank, moved to London, started writing full-time for the FT, published the book, and there was a TV series, and there was a lot of stuff that happened very, very, very suddenly. But that was the base, that was that transition from, in 2001, sitting there with David Bodanis at Shell, saying, I want to write a book, through to late 2005, the book is published in America. Early 2006, it's published in the UK. And somehow I also am writing editorials for the FT. So over the course of those 5 years, there was that process of writing the book, editing the book, trying to sell the book, having this internship at the FT, that not directly leading to anything, but keeping that relationship going, and then finally showing up for work full-time to do a grown-up job of expressing the FT's opinions on economics to the world. And I mean, the reason that story is sort of complicated, I think it's worth going through the complexity of that story, because I think it shows how there's a lot of different things going on at the same time, a lot of moving parts, and what appeared to be an overnight success, and in some ways was an overnight success. I mean, it was incredibly lucky with how that book caught fire. And there's some people wanted to make a TV show as well. And then Radio 4 came calling. There's a lot of stuff happening very quickly, but it was not quite as overnight as it might have seemed. It had its origins back in 2001.
And it is an amazing book, and I think probably one of the most successful economics books of possibly all time. I don't know. You sold something like 1.5 million copies, and essentially for
something like
people
that. Yeah.
people who haven't read it, it takes a series of observations from the life that we all experience and tries to explain how they come about through the lens of economics. I think it's a wonderful book to read if you're just interested in how and why the world works as it does, and certainly if you want to think like an economist, which is, I think, part of what it helps you do. Where did the inspiration from that come from? And have you got a sense of, this is a difficult thing to say, I mean, why was it so phenomenally successful?
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. I don't know why it was so successful. Sometimes books just are popular because they're popular. Something catches and then it just keeps going. There was a zeitgeist that was, I think, in my favor. So Freakonomics had come out 6 months previously. And so there was this sense that economics was kind of cool and people were looking for the same, the next cool economics book. And all of the books that were written to cash in on Freakonomics, they didn't, it takes time to write a book. So they didn't come out for another year or so afterwards, whereas The Undercover Economist, I'd started writing that book before Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner had ever met each other. So it was an environment that I think was fertile soil. As for where it came from, it's hard to say at this distance. It's all a long time ago. I do remember the first draft, the first sort of experiment. It was going to be like a sort of Adrian Mole thing, The Secret Diary of Adam Smith Jr. It was this young economist who was kind of going through the world and trying to solve problems. And I think he probably had problems with his love life as well. That didn't go anywhere. But in the end, I did find a sort of voice. It's an interesting sort of illustration of the power of constraints as well, because I didn't really know anything about reporting. So there isn't really much reporting in the book. There were some places I happened to go and kind of look around and was interested in. But the idea of, phoning up somebody who knew something and asking them, that idea had not really occurred to me, that was a thing one could do. I was still in the mode of a student. So all a student can do is kind of read books, read academic articles and look around. I was still in that mode. And that's probably not ideal, but I think it created this interesting and possibly quite accessible voice that, rather than going off and reading some erudite tome and then turning around and trying to explain it, the starting point was, I was in Costa Coffee the other day, and there's this funny sort of thing, doesn't really make any sense from the point of view of an economist. And you got the problem of explaining why this thing that seems obvious to everybody else is not in fact obvious to an economist. So you have to bring people along and say, let me convince you why this thing is actually weird. And then, having convinced you that this thing is weird, let me explain how, why it happens. So there was that sort of mode of thinking, I think. And a lot of it was just, what's the most interesting thing that any economics lecturer ever told me about this subject or that subject? I remember sitting in on an industrial economics class, and the teacher, I think it was was it Hay? Donald Hay, I think maybe, was the lecturer, and he said, it was about price discrimination. He said, this is how you make money. Like, price discrimination, this is how to make money in business. So this is this is the kind of like the most financially useful piece of economics that anyone is ever going to teach you. So I thought, okay. I mean, it wasn't that I particularly wanted to make money, but I was like, okay, this sounds interesting. Tell me more. So there's a lot of price discrimination in the early chapters of that book, and that's an interesting idea to people. So yeah, that's where it came from.
And that, I guess, changed your life. You then you became a columnist on the FT, but as you say, the BBC came calling, and from uncertainty, I suppose, about where your career would take you, you became pretty much the go-to communicator about economics.
Yeah. So the TV thing, I think, itself didn't change my life, although it was interesting to do. So before the book had even been published, but while it was coming, I think because of the Freakonomics effect, you had these various TV companies, production companies, who were trying to sell, we should do like a cool economics TV show. And BBC were like, yeah, maybe. Who would present that, and what would that even look like? So they took a chance on me because they were interested in this book that was coming out, and it was called "Trust Me, I'm an Economist." 4 episodes, half an hour each. I think pretty much sank without trace, but very, very interesting to work on and see how TV worked. But because that was in the air, then Radio 4 then came calling. And the reason they came calling was Andrew Dilnot, who of course you will know very well, Paul, as your I think your direct predecessor at the IFS, or one of your
predecessors.
Robert Choate was there, wasn't he? Yes.
But
So anyway,
my first boss at the IFS.
a great figure at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and he had, as a side hustle, established this radio program called More or Less with a BBC producer called Michael Blastland. The two of them had hatched this idea that somebody should do a radio program that explained statistical thinking, really, numbers, and put numbers into perspective. And that, I think, first aired maybe 2002, and it didn't have many episodes. There were a few episodes and then a long break, and a few more episodes and a long break. But it had quietly was very much admired, of course, because it was brilliant. And then in I think late 2006, early 2007, something like that, Dilnot and Blastland decided that they were going to stop. And the BBC weirdly thought, well, I guess that's it for More or Less, because there's nobody else who could possibly make this program if Andrew's leaving, which I think is a weird thing to think, actually. It's not that Andrew isn't brilliant, and Andrew and Michael behind the scenes, both brilliant, but they had such a strong idea that obviously any idiot can present this program, and I do. So anyway, thankfully, somebody at the BBC thought, maybe rather than just canning this program that we all think is actually very good, maybe we should see if we could find another presenter. And there's this new guy with a book out who's got this TV show. Maybe let's give him a try. And so that was 2007, and I've been presenting More or Less for 18 years now. Extraordinary. But yeah, that's how it. Unlike Michael and Andrew, I'm unwilling to let go. So they haven't kicked me out yet. So I'm still holding on to it.
You presumably enjoy it rather a lot if you've been doing it that long. I do
enjoy it. I do enjoy it. I mean, it's an incredibly important program, I think, and I say that not to exaggerate my own role, because I am just the presenter, but I think the idea of having Radio 4. And it's also on the World Service, with a huge audience on the World Service. Having the BBC throw its weight behind just a serious-minded look at the data, the evidence behind all kinds of claims in politics and in commerce and elsewhere, I think is incredibly important. And once you've got that basic idea, you can go anywhere. You can do silly stuff. You can do serious stuff. I mean, just earlier today, as I speak to you, I interviewed somebody about, is the menopause driving women aged 45 to 55 out of the workforce? Very, very interesting conversation with a really, really smart economist who's really been thinking hard about this question. And I also interviewed an expert on football finance as to how it is that Manchester United can be so terrible at football, and yet everyone still says they're one of the world's most valuable clubs. That's the sort of range you can have. We recently had an item on, there's this telescope that they say you can see golf balls on the moon. Can you see golf balls on the moon? No, you can't. But we're also unpacking the numbers behind personal independence payments, which were that week that we were recording, they were this huge political and economic issue for the country. Really, really important. And we were just sort of digging down and trying to make it all work. What a privilege that I get to work with smart people who are going away, doing the research, talking to the experts, and then we have the time to really take these stories seriously in a way that something like the Today programme, which is another Radio 4 stalwart, they don't have the same amount of time. So people often say, the Today programme messed that up, but you guys did better. And I think, well, it's nice that people say that, but the Today programme has to set all this stuff up overnight and then air it live. Whereas we can just sit on it for 2 weeks, thinking really hard about it until we get the answer right. It's just a different game.
Have you ever got the answer wrong?
Oh, of course.
More or less.
Yeah, we get the answer wrong all the time. We tried to get it right, for sure. We tried to speak to the right people. We tried to ask the right questions. And if there's uncertainty, we try to explain the uncertainty. But yeah, mistakes are inevitable, often because people assume that I don't make mistakes. So if I have just put something in the script that's just got, I've just not carried the decimal point and I'm wrong by a factor of 10, no one ever questions that. So yeah, we make mistakes, but I think that we try not to, but when we make mistakes, then we explain them.
It's just brilliant listening to you, Tim. You're so full of different kind of ideas and information and so on. But alongside more or less, you've also written an extraordinary number of books. You do a podcast. You write for the Financial Times. I mean, where does all of this come from? The number of ideas, the amount of information, the insatiable curiosity. I mean, what is its root, and how do you keep that newness, that novelty?
Well, and the world is full of new and interesting ideas. I mean, you just go to a good bookshop and look around. Yeah, I mean, it really, there's so many interesting ideas there to be explored. Pick up a good newspaper. There's always a new story, a new thing in the world. So the world never stops giving you interesting things to read, interesting people to talk to, interesting ideas to muse over. And what I find fun is trying to convey why I find these things interesting, tell an interesting story, or introduce somebody to a counterintuitive idea. And I don't see myself slowing down anytime soon on that.
And Tim, is that always a kind of, if you look hard enough, there's an economics explanation for almost anything you've ever come across?
I used to think that, and my second book, The Logic of Life, really takes that to an extreme. But now I'm not sure I'd want to make that argument. I'm not sure I find that argument as interesting as I used to find it. Yeah, sure, maybe there's an economics angle to everything. I think probably there is an economics angle to almost everything, but it's not the only angle. So I don't have to restrict myself to economics. There are other ideas, there are other ways to explore the world that I find interesting. My podcast, Cautionary Tales, is about things going wrong. So true stories about things going wrong and the lessons that we can learn. And the lessons are often not a lesson about economics, that it might be a lesson about psychology, or it might be a lesson about politics, or it might be a lesson about engineering. So I studied economics formally for 5 years, but I'm 51 years old. So it would be odd to be completely constrained by the lens of economics. Powerful as that lens is, and interesting as I continue to find it, it's not the only way to see interesting patterns in the world.
But Tim, I mean, as we come to the end of the podcast, I mean, it's absolutely true that economics is only a part of the world, but it is an important part. And are there one or two or three learnings from economics that you think is actually the most important thing that more people understand? I mean, that's really a lot of what your writing has been about, is to give people a lens into how economics helps you to understand the world. If there were just a couple of things that you think the world would be a much better place if many more people understood this, I mean, what would they be?
Well, let me give you two, and let me give you one that I wish economists understood more. So one is just the possibility of non-zero sum games, but by which I mean situations where everybody can potentially be better off. And that sort of thinking, although economists have a reputation for being very kind of gloomy and downbeat and no free lunches, actually economics is often about finding ways in which everybody could be better off one way or another. So the most classic example of that is the idea of trade and gains from trade. But it's not just there, it's everywhere in economics. And I think that that's a very important starting point when you're thinking about the world, to say, is there a way that we could do this that would make everybody better off? Is there, in fact, a free lunch that we could have? And it's not usually going to be trivial. The free lunches tend to be hidden, but they are, in fact, there. And weirdly, although economists are famous for saying there's no such thing as a free lunch, actually, economics is all about discovering the free lunches and figuring out how to get them. So that's the one thing. The second thing, more generally, I think it's really worth paying attention to the magnitude of certain effects. Is this big or is this not big? Is this something that's worth getting worried about or not worth getting worried about? The classic thing we always ask on more or less is that actually a big number? And people don't have an intuitive sense at all about the difference between millions and billions. Or you very often, another item we did recently on more or less was one person dies in a fall every 20 seconds. First of all, that turns out not to be true, but also there are 8 billion people in the world. It's really hard to know whether in fact we should be surprised or worried if it was true that one person died in a fall every 20 seconds. Like, is that actually, that doesn't really convey whether that's an issue or not. And it's so often that you hear things expressed in that way. So I think economics gets us focused on, like, what are the small things, what are the big things, what's worth worrying about and what is not worth worrying about. The thing I think economists should pay more attention to is the details of how the world actually works. I think very often economics is such a powerful engine for abstraction, and that's great. It can be really, really good to think about problems in an abstract way. There's a certain point where you actually have to zoom in and say, how is this actually going to work? The people who are affected by this policy or by this idea, how is it going to work? Or what are the loopholes? Or what are the possible ways in which it could backfire? And when I think back to one of the most important economic events of my lifetime, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, a lot of people think, oh, the economic models let us down. I don't think it was the economic models that let us down. I think it was the fact that we economists were thinking in a very generic way about how finance worked. We were absolutely not interested in the details of the sorts of contracts that were being written and where they put the risk and how they might backfire. We weren't thinking about them the way, for example, a lawyer might have thought about them, or a scammer might have thought about them, or an anthropologist might have thought about them. So that interest in the details, I think, is often not built into economics, and that's something it behoves every economist to kind of add into their intellectual repertoire.
I think that is ever so important in our world, understanding actually the real details of the tax system or the welfare system or what have you is absolutely vital in what we do to making sense of it. But my sense is that there is much too much economics, which is, here's the data set, let's see what we can do with the data set, rather than what else can we go out and find out about how people are really behaving, or how the contracts really work, or how the incentives are actually constructed. I'd certainly very much agree with that.
Yes, in my book, How to Make the World Add Up, I call this premature enumeration. I think a lot of economists suffer from it.
And Tim, tell us what's next for you.
So I am still working on Cautionary Tales. I'm still working on More or Less, still loving the Financial Times column. 20 years, they still haven't kicked me out. Who knows? Could be any time now. But at the moment, I'm working on a new book, which will be my 11th book. Oh. And it is about how data built the modern world. So how the civilization around us can't be understood unless you have a really, really deep understanding of decisions that were made to gather data at certain points, going all the way back 7,000 years to Mesopotamia, a Renaissance accountants, 1066 and 1086 and the Doomsday Book, and some of the very dark things that were done with data in the 1930s, the 1940s, and then looking forward to how we can use data in a wiser way to build a better world. So I'm learning a tremendous amount. I learn something every day working on the book. It won't be out for quite a while, but it's just a wonderful project to be able to work on.
We're I'm sure all looking forward to that book. Tim, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely extraordinary and actually terribly brief run through your incredibly fertile mind. I certainly feel somewhat rejuvenated just having spoken to you. So much excitement and curiosity is still there, and so much more to discover in the world.
Thank you. It's very kind of you.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. If the conversation got you thinking about your career or what might come next, then I offer one-to-one coaching. And you can find out more details on my website, michaelkellcoaching.com.
And if you enjoyed the discussion about the economics, do obviously look at the website of my old organisation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. But even more importantly, there are some excellent books recently written by me and others, Challenging Inequalities, which, as you can imagine, looks at the whole issue of inequality, and slightly older, but still very much in date, Follow the Money. So do have a look at those if you thought anything that you heard about the economics of what we're going through was of any interest.
And we hope you can join us for the next episode of Econ to Icon.